Hello, everyone. I'm Laura Greiner, your host for today's Swine podcast. And with me today, I have Dr. Erin Holmes, who's with Cargill as a swine nutritionist. Erin, how are you today?
I'm doing well. Thank you, Laura.
Well, glad to have you on today, Erin. For our audience who may not be familiar with you, would you mind sharing a little bit of your background?
Sure. Yeah, so I grew up on a small 𝘬𝘓𝘵 hog farm in west central Minnesota. Did my bachelor's and master's at North Dakota State University in Fargo, and then PhD in swine nutrition at University of Minnesota. And then for the last 7 years, I have been with Cargill as a swine nutritionist.
Wonderful. Well, we were visiting a little bit ahead of time, and one of the topics that I think we want to talk about right now is what to do with our sows in the summertime. And as you know, sows are something that's really near and dear to me, and I think the timing is perfect. We were just talking about how the weather is starting to change here, and the grass is growing and the sun is getting warmer. So as we think about this for our farmers, what would be some things that pop into your mind immediately when we think about sows and summer nutrition management?
Yeah, so when it comes to feeding sows in the summer, one of the biggest areas of concern is lactation and lactation feed intake, that heat stress response that sows experience when they're in lactation. Lactation is a very heat intensive phase that they're going through and experiencing. And then putting on top of that our higher temperatures and humidity, we enter into heat stress when we would typically see sows back off on feed intake when we're trying to get them to eat as much feed as possible. So, there's really two ways that we can approach nutrient intake, which were really what we're trying to do when we talk about feed intake. And we can drive voluntary feed intake, or we can talk about the nutrient concentration of the diet.
Mm-hmm. Let's start with nutrient concentration of the diet. I think that's the one that most of us jump to immediately. Mm-hmm. Certainly probably our most common ingredient in the summer is fat. But with where prices are today, obviously we're reconsidering that thought. So what are your thoughts today on nutrient management with sows?
Yeah, so you're exactly right, Laura. Traditionally, the common practice for a summer lactation diet change would be to increase lysine level based on what we think that reduction in feed intake is going to be. So we're continuing to achieve the same level of amino acid intake, and then we would add fat to the diet to increase the energy density of the diet. Fat, while we get energy from several macro ingredients, fat is just very concentrated source of energy. It's going to provide some dust control. It's going to facilitate fat soluble vitamin absorption. And then also kind of, again, towards that summer piece, it's going to have what we call a lower heat increment. So the amount of heat that is produced by the animal to digest and utilize that is going to be lower than, say, other feed ingredients like fibers or protein. So that historically has been a few of the advantages of just adding fat to increase our energy density of the diet. But like you said, with where fat prices have gone the last 18 months, that's a much more expensive proposition to just go ahead and add fat to the diet. And so we have had questions from customers that we work with kind of on that note of, do we need to add fat, or do we need to add this, a certain amount of fat in the lactation diet still, or, what are the other alternatives that we could achieve that increase in energy nutrient intake?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and so I think that's a really fair point. Fiber would be one that we think about with sows. They seem to kind of have a different nutrient utilization with their intestine as far as being able to maybe get some VFAs out of fiber. But you just mentioned, of course, that fiber has a higher heat increment. So are there any things that pop to your head today on what we might need to think about in terms of alternatives to fat?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So alternative feed ingredients, bakery would be an ingredient that's higher energy. Certainly not as high as fat. Again, fat is that really energy dense ingredient. But bakery can come into lactation diets. Distillers can come into lactation diets. Like you said, there's a little bit of, we're introducing some additional heat with digestion. What does that end up kind of, if you will, costing us? But there is certainly diet savings to using distillers. And even, phosphorus. The price of monocal has increased a lot, and some people just simply aren't even able to get it. So distillers does have a readily available form of phosphorus. So there are some pros and cons to consider. From my experience, we see a wide variety and comfort level of using distillers in lactation diets, and reasonably so. And primarily, the big one is going to be mycotoxins. So we do have people that use quite a bit of distillers in lactation, and they seem to do it quite successfully, though there's a lot of monitoring and quality control in place to understand all of the macro ingredients that are going into that lactation feed.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's really good. The other thing that we visited a little bit about that you had mentioned earlier were enzymes. Any thoughts on that if we want to go a step further?
Yeah. So one thing kind of on the table for discussion, it's probably not something necessarily to blanket recommend for everyone at this point, but yeah, something like the use of a carbohydrate such as like a xylanase. Certainly for the cost of it, it's relatively inexpensive today. And there's not just from the nutrient release that it might provide, but also if you think of some of the work that we've seen in grow finish pig, just from the health and mortality side of it, there's some things there to consider as well. In addition with that, though, it's probably best to consider the macro ingredients of the diet and the substrate that those enzymes would be working on. So, for example, if you were using a little bit higher level of distillers in lactation, given their intake, then yeah, a xylanase maybe would fit because you have that available substrate for the xylanase to work on.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Perfect. I think those are all really good suggestions around things that we can consider with our nutrient management perspective of the diet nutrient concentration. But I'm going to go back now a little bit deeper. So you mentioned way at the beginning of this conversation, increasing lysine level. So how do we know where we need to go? How do we help producers understand what nutritionists are thinking about when we say, well, we're going to increase lysine?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So having some sort of an idea of what, even if it's of intake, even if it's based on feed deliveries and the number of sows in stalls that are being fed on a rolling average, we're not asking to go and weigh feed for all sows or even a subsample, but just some marker of, this is what in cooler season a general average intake is. And then when we move into warmer seasons, depending upon your geography, this is the change in feed intake. So you might see it to be a pound difference. And so then we would take that into account to achieve our grams of amino acids or grams of lysine.
Yeah, I think you just hit the key point right there, right? used to talk percent lysine, what percent lysine's in the diet, but particularly for sows, that feed intake is so critical to ensure that we're getting to a set grams of lysine. Because we know if we don't get there, right, we don't get the wean to estrus, we lose litter growth rate. And so I think that's very important for our farmers to understand. And litter growth rate would be one that I would encourage too, right, to kind of know how much weight they're going to put on those pigs.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and in general, we talk about voluntary feed intake. We want to minimize body weight loss of the sow. In general, she's probably going to put it into her pigs as opposed to put it onto her body during the lactation phase. So any groceries, as I sometimes call them, any nutrients that we can get into her during lactation, especially a time when intake is a little bit challenged, is a value to her, not just for that litter, but then the subsequent litter. And I think that's one area that we've really tried to spend some time talking with our producers that we work with, is that, really we're talking about feeding sows during the summer, but there's a downstream effect here in that whole cascade of seasonal infertility. And those pigs then that get produced, so let's think about the flow. So say she farrows in July, August, she's going to breed then again August, September, or wean breed. And then those pigs that she farrows are going to come to market kind of in that June, July timeframe. Those tend to be our most profitable months of our marketing season and cycles. So this really, talking about feeding sows during summer now, is setting us up for what our profit potential could look like come next summer. And we've spent a lot of time with grow finish pigs and talking about our summer strategies this year, really, in talking about sows and summer lactation this year. We're already thinking about marketing pigs for next year.
Absolutely. And that's something that's sometimes hard to think about, right? We're already right. 10 months into next year's cycle when we start talking about breeding the sow this summer. So absolutely a good point. You made up you made a mention of increasing voluntary feed intake, and you said it now a couple of times. So let's really dig into that, because I think it's important. And you can correct me. The rule of thumb I always would use for producers is the sow needs 4 pounds of feed for herself, and she needs 1 pound of feed for every pig that she's nursing. And so, the target then, if she's got 12 pigs, is 16 pounds of feed. So how do we do that, right? Especially in the summer. How do we get that voluntary feed intake? You have any thoughts on that for our audience?
Yeah. So, some of it all comes all the way back to gestation. So getting those sows in appropriate body condition going into farrowing. So to some degree, we can start our summer feeding strategy for sows in lactation today in gestation. Those sows, if they come into lactation heavy on body condition, they don't eat as well. They probably could have some farrowing complications. So it's just kind of a spiral effect there if we don't have them set up in good body condition coming into lactation. Ventilation in an environment in the room. So making sure that your temperature curves are set correctly, and that fans and cool cells, if you have them, that they are functioning the way that they should. Another one would be water intake. Water's not water, but also just the delivery of it. So some things we talked about kind of before we jumped on the recording here. Water pressure is one to kind of consider or to measure. And that, the neighboring sow should not be able to drink her neighbor's sow. So you don't want the garden hose effect where, they get blasted in the face and that kind of backs them off or turns them away from drinking water. Also, thinking about the transition from gestation to lactation. In gestation, there's different water delivery methods. So some might be on a water trough, some might be on water nipples, but particularly if you're going from a trough to a water nipple, there's that change. And especially if it's a young female that's not familiar with the water nipple, that can be a reason of why maybe their water intake isn't what it should be or could be. And both of those, all the water intake can lead us down a road of constipation. So again, that kind of goes back to the fiber in gestation part as well. But constipated sows will also back off of feed and won't eat as well or as much as they should and could. And there's a relationship to feed intake and water intake. So I think kind of the rule of thumb I've always heard is 3-to-1 there on that relationship of water and feed. And so if she's not drinking enough, she's probably also not eating what she could.
Yeah, I think one of the things that always maybe frustrates me in a barn, and I know it frustrates others, is the guilt. Right? She's younger. She's inexperienced walking into the farrowing house, so she doesn't recognize her surroundings. And then, of course, we're having her farrow out these little creatures that are now surrounding her all day. And so she's trying to figure all of this out. So how do we help her during those summer months? Because to me, she's probably our most critical animal, particularly in the summer, right? Year round, but particularly in the summer.
Yeah. Like you said, particularly in the summer and year round. But again, we're just compounding factors here when it comes to summer. But, if you have the ability to kind of group those young females up together in your rooms, you at least identify, hey, this is the row or this is the section that we need to pay particular attention to in terms of making sure that they aren't backing off feed. Also, again, kind of around all of those items on water quality or water intake, excuse me. And then again, that transition. So kind of one thought I've seen, kind of little trick is that to kind of understand or know if a gilt or a sow has consumed water after coming into farrowing is to put a little peanut butter on the nipple waterer. So it's one, an attractant, but two, then if the peanut butter's gone, that there's a high likelihood that she has found the water and is drinking. So
I like that trick. Yeah, we were talking about the old PED days with limestone on the water nipples and looking for that. But I like the peanut butter. That's a good one for today. And you're right, sows will like that. So I think that's actually a really novel way to try to help farm staff, particularly very quickly and easy identify animals that aren't getting what they need from a water perspective.
Mm-hmm.
How about just from a general barn management perspective, anything we can do from a feeding strategy standpoint for the summer months that might be different than other times of year?
Yeah, so females, sows, gilts are more apt to consume feed in the cooler part of the day. So later in the evening, maybe overnight, but earlier in the morning. So one consideration would be to adjust when your feed lines run, so that if you come in early in the morning and you have sows that have cleaned up all of their feed, that's great. However, maybe they could have also consumed another, half pound, before you came in, and they didn't have the opportunity to do that. So just, monitoring how many sows have cleaned up their feed first thing in the morning before that feed line runs, and then adjusting the run times of lines accordingly so that there aren't as many sows that have cleaned up everything.
Yeah, I think it's a good point. One of the rule of thumbs I always learned was while the sun might be at its most intense at about 3 o'clock in the afternoon, at least in the Midwest in the summer, the sows and the animals don't really experience the heat stress until till about 5 o'clock, right? So we need to plan on them not really becoming active in their feed intake until a few hours after the sun is at its most intense, and that's when it starts to kind of cool off for the evening, if you will. And so I think that's a very good point of how do we set those systems up from an automated standpoint to ensure that everybody's getting food. But then what if you're hand feeding? How do you make sure there's food present before workers go home? So I agree. I like that. I like that idea. Any tips or tricks on how to get a gilt to eat more feed?
Yeah, great question. Wet dry feeding can help there, just to encourage, stimulate some feed intake. Though if she's not eating it, then you do kind of have to be, especially in the summer, it's a really good environment for feed to go sour pretty quickly. So there's pros and cons to it, but that would be a way to get them to a little more feed intake into them. You could go down there are some additives out there as well that seem to give some stimulation to feed intake. So those would be, and of course that would be applicable across parities. But again, that young female is, if anyone in the barn, they're going to be the most compromised during that time. And they do represent a fair number of females in the herd.
Absolutely. And I think when we talk about replacement rates and the concerns we have today with culling, that's an important thing, is we need to focus on that young female and try to find a way to keep her in the herd and keep her productive. So one of the other things that I used to think about too is just frequency of getting the animals up. And so any thoughts on that? I mean, obviously we don't want to disturb them between the hours of 12 and 3, but any thoughts on how often we get them up, or any other maybe tricks that we should encourage the farm staff to think about for the summer?
Additional tip or trick to get sows and gilts particularly to eat more during lactation. Getting them up would be, with labor challenges, if you can achieve one time a day, that would be good. Kind of some of the things that it would offer, it kind of stimulates them to get up and eat, drink if they haven't. If she has a challenge in getting up or doesn't want to get up, that would identify the females that need some attention, whether that's a treatment or just further monitoring. But again, just some further attention that she would need. Getting them up would also stimulate defecation. So if you have some constipation going on, probably most likely to see that in that first week before, kind of as they're getting up onto full feed. Interacting and getting sows up would also help achieve that.
I think those are all really good tips for summer, and I know we could continue to talk more, and I'm sure people may have some questions related to diet formulation and so forth that they certainly can reach out to you and ask for more detail, but we're kind of wrapping up our time. So I was wondering if you could maybe give the audience just a few key points or take-home points today as they're getting ready to head into summer, what they should be doing in their barns.
Yeah, I think one of the biggest things to remember is that, the long-term downstream effect that summer lactation feed intake has on the whole production system. So while we're talking about, feeding sows for this summer, it's that subsequent farrowing that really gets impacted. And when those pigs are born, when they're marketing, they're going to hit in the summer of next year, during likely to be our most profitable months. So that would probably be the big thing. And then two, we can voluntary feed intake. any, whether it's barn management, environment related. We can do things diet formulation wise to overcome the change or reduction in nutrient intake. At the end of the day, we're going for nutrient intake.
Perfect. I think that's a great wrap up of what we discussed today, Erin. So as you know, we like to ask our guest speakers a couple of questions. So the first one I like to ask is really around a swine resource book. Is there a resource in general? So is there a resource that you would recommend to the audience?
Yeah, so I think a couple books that I more frequently pull off the shelf. One is going to be Swine Nutrition, which I'm sure several of your guests have said in the past, and then the Gestating and Lactating Sow. It's always a phase area of production that I've enjoyed, appreciated. I've spent, of all the, growing up on a 𝘬𝘪𝘵 farm, farrowing barn was probably my favorite place to spend my time. So it's just always been a phase that I've really enjoyed.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I have a couple of those books. I do enjoy the Lactating Sow book. I still give it to people to read periodically. So I think it's definitely a good resource and one we haven't heard on the podcast. So the next question we like to ask is really, are there any other books that you would recommend that aren't pig related?
Yeah, so I guess more so maybe from an author, because I can't pick, I guess, one favorite. So I'll kind of go with the author. Probably one of my favorite authors would be Elizabeth Elliot. So for those that aren't familiar with her husband was a missionary and was actually killed while doing mission work with a group of people. And actually she then kind of came in behind them and continued that ministry there. So kind of became an author after that and have really enjoyed her writing.
I'll have to check those out. I've not heard of her before. So very good. Well, the last question we like to ask is, if you think about somebody who in your life you feel is successful, what characteristic or trait do you feel like they possess that's allowed them to become successful?
Yeah, so I'd probably, there's probably several traits that come to mind. I guess maybe a couple that rise to the top are going to be just humility and not being afraid to ask questions and not making assumptions. And then two, just determination. And that kind of, I think, can incorporate to just being flexible and adaptable to challenges, but also to change. Because certainly as our industry knows, it seems like certainly every year, maybe even every month, there's something new that we haven't seen. And that's certainly been evident the last few years. That we've seen. So
absolutely. I think that's a great tip, particularly where we're at today. So that's wonderful. For our audience, again, this is Dr. Erin Holmes with Cargill. She is one of their swine nutritionists. Erin, we do want to thank you for your time today and all the tips and tricks that you shared with us.
Thank you, Laura. Enjoyed it.
Great. Take care.
Imagine if, with a few key concepts, you could have the potential to create a massive positive impact by bringing from hundreds of thousands to millions of dollars for swine producers. Join us on this small group and go to the next level of swine nutrition on this 7-week-long elite online training in applied swine nutrition and feeding by myself and my world-class invited speakers. Additionally, you enjoy an exclusive community to exchange ideas. Go now to www.eliteswinenutritionist.com.